Let's take a look at a weakening question. Starting with the question stem, which one of the following, if true, would most weaken the ethicist argument? So there are a couple of things I want to point out. First, notice what's different about the state of the answers. Right? In weakening questions, we're told that these are just take them to be true. Totally different from MSS MBT questions where the answers weren't presumed to be true. You had to prove that the answers were true by appealing to support from the stimulus, right? So that's the first difference. Second, of course, it says weaken, so that's your clue that it's a weakening question. Third is that there is an argument. Okay, so let's examine the argument. Make sure we understand the argument, which means you got to do your premise, conclusion labeling, and you also have to understand the support, right? You have to ask yourself, on the spectrum of support, how strong is the support? So ethicist says, on average, animals raised on grain must be fed 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat. So let's just bring that down to earth. Let's think of cows, right? Cows are an animal raised on grain. You got to feed cows 16 pounds of grain in order to produce 1 pound of beef. Okay. A pound of beef is more nutritious for humans than a pound of grain. Well, yeah, of course, a pound of, a steak, right? A pound of steak versus a pound of wheat. I mean, of course, a pound of steak is, but wait, didn't you say it takes 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat, though, right? So why are you comparing rather 1 to 1? Oh, because, the ethicist is not really comparing 1 to 1, right? The ethicist says 16 pounds of grain could feed many more people than could a pound of meat, right? This sort of turns out to just kind of be a throwaway point. She's saying, of course, I concede that a pound of meat is more nutritious than a pound of grain, but we're talking about 16 pounds of grain that it took to produce that 1 pound of meat. And the point I really want to make is that, right, with this but, 16 pounds of grain can feed many more people than could a pound of meat. With grain yields leveling off, large areas of farmland going out of production each year, population rapidly expanding, we must accept the fact that consumption of meat will soon be morally unacceptable. Finally, we arrive at our conclusion. All of this is premise, right? Maybe with the exception of this point, which sounds like it's just kind of a concession point. The rest of this is premise, trying to support this conclusion, the conclusion that it will soon be morally unacceptable to consume meat. Why? Right? We always ask this, why? I like eating meat, but you're telling me it's wrong to eat meat? Why? Well, okay, let's look at where meat comes from. Get 1 pound of steak, you got to use up 16 pounds of grain. 16 pounds of grain can feed way more people than 1 pound of meat can. On the one hand, supply is leveling off, right? Grain yields are leveling off, supply of food. When I say supply, I mean supply of food, right? But demand is still growing because population is expanding. So those are the reasons why it will soon be unacceptable to eat meat. Now, I feel like you probably already can think of a lot of counter arguments, poke holes in this argument. But before we do that, I want to take this, and do what we did in the theory, which is kind of situated from explicitly stated. I won't go all the way over. This end will just be consistent. Okay, consistent with, because that part doesn't matter. Over to strongly implied over here is just somewhere in between, right? Where would you place this argument in terms of its strength? In other words, how convinced are you that consumption of meat will soon be morally unacceptable on the basis of the premises offered? Okay, I say that, I emphasize that because I don't know, you might be a vegetarian, you might be vegan, in which case you might have responded to my question of how convinced are you. You're like, of course, I'm super convinced, but that's not the point, right? I'm not asking based on your pre-existing ideas of, the morality of eating meat. No, I'm asking you to do an analysis of the argument. On the basis of these premises, how well supported is this conclusion? In other words, where do I put this? Right? If you think it's a really strong argument, then you probably put this thing something like this. You'd be like, yeah, no, totally. This follows very strongly from this. If you think it's even stronger, then you put it over here. You'd be like, yeah, if these premises are true, then it must be true that eating meat is morally unacceptable. Okay, so that's wrong, by the way. The support structure, while it exists, it's not that strong, not even close. Okay? In fact, I wouldn't even put it over here. I would land this somewhere over here. A little bit better than consistent with. The reason why, look, you have to recognize that there is some support, in other words, flowing from the premise to the conclusion. There's some support for eating meat being morally unacceptable because supplies are leveling off, demand is growing. It could get to the point where me eating beef means you starving. If it gets to that point, then yeah, I 100% accept the conclusion that it's morally unacceptable for me to eat meat in that circumstance. But maybe it doesn't get to that level, right? Like, I mean, you tell me grain yields are leveling off, fine, okay, and population is rapidly expanding. Okay, but like, do these lines cross, right? Do you see what I mean? Like, okay, grain yields are leveling off, but it's leveling off at a rate that still far exceeds what we need to feed everybody on the planet. In which case, I don't really care that it's leveling off, right? And from the other perspective, you can say, okay, population is expanding, but how quickly? Is population expanding so rapidly that we're in danger of running out of food or not? Do you see, that's also a relevant question. So there, I've started to talk about assumptions that the argument's making. Do you see, and I don't know the answer to those assumptions. And just like how we saw in the theory lesson, if you toggle the assumption one way, okay, that strengthens the argument, right? But if you toggle the assumption the other way, well, that weakens the argument. And it's precisely our job to weaken the argument. We got to toggle these. I mean, look, answer choices might talk about assumptions that I hadn't even thought of. And chances are that's what's going to happen. Okay, for weakening questions, this is a big point of departure from must be true questions and pointed issue questions where I said in those lessons that sometimes you can even anticipate what the answer might be. For weakening questions, I almost never try to do that, unless it's some just glaring, obvious thing with the argument. Like, most of the time, I'm just like, okay, keeping an open mind. The support structure is what it is. It's an okay argument. It's not a great argument. It's not a flawed argument, right? A flawed argument is where the support structure will land on this side of the graph. It's just an okay argument. And my job is to make this okay argument less okay, right? Make it worse. And the way to do that is by toggling the assumptions, playing around with assumptions. So let's take a look at some of the answers. Starting with answer choice A. Even though it's been established that a vegetarian diet can be healthy, many people prefer to eat meat and are willing to pay for it. Okay, so A tells us some new information and we're to take this information as true, right? It's true. Vegetarian diets can be healthy, got it. And it's many people's preference to eat meat, understood. And not only are they preferring to eat meat, they are also willing to pay to eat meat. Okay, understood. But I don't see how this has anything to do with argument. Does this make my argument less likely or more like, right? Do you see, are the premises now more supportive or less supportive of the conclusion? The answer is neither. You don't want to confuse preference to do a thing and willingness to pay for the thing, or even the health benefits or harms of doing a thing, with the morality of doing a thing. The argument is trying to argue to the conclusion that eating meat will be morally unacceptable because of the danger of you eating meat and someone else starving. That's the argument. It's not a response to the argument to say, oh, but I prefer to eat meat and I'm rich, so I can buy it, right? I don't care that. And then like this point is just kind of a distraction throwaway point. It's like, I don't care that vegetarian diet can be healthy, right? You go be the vegetarian. I prefer to eat meat and I can afford to pay for it. Do you see? That's what A is doing, though. That's what A is saying, but it's not a response to this argument because the ethicist would just repeat what she already said. She's like, okay, clearly you didn't get the point, right? Let me just say my argument again. Grain yields are leveling off. Population is rapidly expanding. It takes 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat. The danger is that there's not going to be enough food to go around. That's why I'm saying it's morally unacceptable to eat meat. It has nothing to do with your preferences, has nothing to do with whether you can pay for it. Let's look at C now, which says if a grain diet is supplemented with protein derived from non-animal sources. Okay, so I'm eating mostly wheat, right, a grain diet, but I supplement that diet with protein derived from, say, soybeans, right, non-animal sources, soybeans. Okay, so that kind of diet, grain plus non-animal sourced proteins, can have nutritional value equivalent to that of a diet containing meat. Okay, thanks, I guess. Right, you're telling me that on the one hand, I can eat beef plus other things. On the other hand, I can eat grain plus tofu. And the two could be nutritionally equivalent. All right, so I guess that's one less thing I have to consider if I'm deciding whether to be a vegetarian or not, right? I don't have to consider nutritional value because, apparently they can be made to be equivalent. fine, but that's not what I was talking about. Do you see, like, it's very common with these wrong answers in weakening questions. You'll see it in strengthening as well when we do strengthening next, that they're trying to distract you. Do you see that? It's like you're trying to engage with an ethicist in this argument. You guys are at a cocktail party and you're actually trying to have this conversation. And then it's like there are a lot of other people in the room and there's a lot of other conversations going around, and answer choice A and answer choice C are just tugging at you. Be like, oh, yeah, but hey, listen to, what about this? Have you considered whether it's possible to create nutritional equivalence between a vegetarian diet and a non-vegetarian diet? Like, yeah, I don't have time for this, right? It's not relevant to the argument, the current argument I'm having. I can turn around and talk to you about this if you want, but it's going to have to wait, because the issue at hand is still whether it is moral or not to eat meat on the basis of these premises. And answer choice C's display of nutritional equivalence between a meat diet and a vegetarian diet doesn't help. Doesn't help to resolve, doesn't help to, prove this argument more. In other words, strengthen it. Doesn't help to weaken this argument. It's not relevant to the analysis. Let's keep going with answer choice D. Although prime farmland near metropolitan areas is being lost rapidly to suburban development, right? Okay, apparently that's happening. So you go near any major city, and around the city there's suburban development, which takes up what used to be prime farmland. Okay, fine, that's true, right? That's true. We could reverse this trend by choosing to live in areas that are already urban, meaning you as a citizen, as a denizen of whatever, New York, Chicago, you can help reverse this trend by choosing to live in the city as opposed to the suburbs surrounding the city. Okay, again, I'm hit with this sense of distraction. I'm trying to figure out the morality of consuming meat on the basis of this these premises, that supplies are leveling off, demand is still growing. There's this huge mismatch between how much grain it takes to generate a pound of meat, right? Is it moral or is it not moral to eat meat? And D is trying to solve a different problem. D is saying, here's one potential solution to the loss of prime farmland near metropolitan areas. Do you see what I mean? It's just not relevant. Okay, so now we're down to two answer choices, B and E. Of course, one of them has to be right. Take some time, consider both, and formulate your own idea about which one you like more. And focus on the reason why. Okay, I don't really care so much if you just blindly guess and get it right. What's important to me is your reasoning. Why do you like B more, or why do you like E more? Try to think about it using the framework of assumptions. Right? This argument is definitely making some assumptions. That's why the support structure is so weak to begin with. If it hadn't made so many assumptions, it would have landed over here. It would have landed over here, right? It made a bunch of assumptions, which is like kind of weak to begin with. Now, the correct answer choice is going to exploit that. It's going to say, oh, you assume X and Y and Z is the case. Well, guess what? You're in for a surprise. X and Y and Z aren't the case. Your assumptions are false. Now, I want to point out that from the very beginning of the argument, we only talked about a certain kind of animal raised for meat, right? Animal raised for meat on grain, right? That's the subset. Now, I say subset, and it's only because, well, one of these answer choices clues me in onto that, right? It's not something I think I would have picked up right off the bat, but they are talking about animals raised on grain. If you're talking about cow or beef raised on grain, then there is this trade-off. It takes 16 pounds of grain to generate 1 pound of meat. And, in the limit where there's a shortage of food, it does seem morally reprehensible to eat 1 pound of steak, because really what you're doing is you're just eating 4 other people's food in the form of grain that could have been, everybody, the 4 of us could have all had wheat and bread, but instead you 3 get to starve and I get to eat a pound of steak, right? Okay, yeah, that does seem morally reprehensible, but that's based on the assumption that you have to play this trade-off game between meat and grain. And it's not clear you do. You sometimes play this trade-off game if you're talking about cow raised on grain, but what if you can raise cow or sheep on grass? And this grass comes from pasture land, which you really can't do much else with, right? It's not like you could use pasture land to do farming because, well, B tells you can't. Do you see, if that were the case, then that weakens this argument, right? All of this is still true, right? All of this is still true, animals raised on grain, you're still playing this trade-off game. In the limit, it still seems morally reprehensible to do this. But wait, hold on. I'm not so sure I have to accept your conclusion that consumption of meat will be morally unacceptable, because aren't you just forgetting about other sources of meat, right? What about animals not raised on grain? What about animals raised on grass? There's no trade-off game here. You can't tell the three other people to eat grass. Do you see what I mean? Like, that's why B is the right answer choice. It's zeroed in on an assumption the argument has made, and it's overturning that assumption. Now, what if you turn the assumption the other way, right? What if we said, you know what, instead of often cattle, sheep can be raised to maturity on grass, what if you said cattle and sheep can never be raised to maturity on grass and pasture land unsuitable for any other kind of farming? Well, that has the opposite effect. That has the effect of strengthening your argument, because now it's more in line with the assumption the argument needs, right? The assumption, in order for this argument to flow, in other words, in order for these premises to support this conclusion, the argument needs to block the idea that there could be other sources of meat where you don't have to play this trade-off game. In other words, the argument has to limit meat to coming from 16 pounds of grain, right? So that's a preview onto what we're going to do next, which is strengthening questions. But even now, I hope you can see that strengthening and weakening are just two sides of the assumption coin. Okay, so now let's talk about E, why E isn't right. So maybe first I want to talk about, if you were attracted to E, E is a super popular answer choice. It's not right, but it's super popular. There's a reason why E is super popular, because LSAT writers are appealing to your intuitions. They're banking on the fact that you don't actually know what you're supposed to do when they say weaken an argument, right? They say weaken an argument. You're thinking, well, I just want to find some reason to, overthrow this conclusion, to not believe this conclusion, right? You're saying ethicist, you're saying, oh, the consumption of meat is morally unacceptable, right? It's wrong to eat meat. I'm not even going to pay attention to why you said it's wrong. I'm just going to find some reason why that's not okay, right? I'm just going to say, well, you know what? You can't just eat a vegetarian diet. That's not enough for human health. So see, there. How do you like that? You have to eat meat. I'm pretty sure some version of that is the psychology that led you to pick E, if you picked E. Now, if that's true, then you have to realize that what you just did there is you failed to engage with the argument. Okay, I'll say that again. You failed to engage with the argument. You ignored the reasons why the ethicist made her conclusion, the reasons stated supporting the conclusion. The reasoning is what we're trying to weaken. Instead, you try to directly attack the conclusion. And to further rub salt in the wound, you didn't even do a good job of that. Note what E is actually saying. Nutritionists agree that a diet composed solely of grain products is not adequate for human health. Fine, that's true. Assuming you want to be healthy, don't eat a diet composed solely of grain products. That doesn't mean you have to eat meat. Do you see what I mean? Like, E is not even saying nutritionists agree that a diet devoid of meat products is not adequate for human health, which I think is the version you had in your mind, if you were of the persuasion to choose E. Rather, this answer choice is merely saying a diet composed solely of grain products. Who said to eat only bread, right? Only bread and pasta, that's all you get to eat. Why can't you eat protein from plant sources? Why can't you eat fish? Do you see what I mean? Like, it's not even doing the thing that you thought it was doing. Very common tactic for an answer choice to bait you into ignoring the premises, ignoring the reasoning given, the reasoning for the conclusion, and baiting you into a direct frontal assault on the conclusion. And then, of course, it fails. It's not even attacking the conclusion. Now that we understand what E is actually saying, let this be an opportunity to learn. This is a common type of trap that will repeat. The real answer choice, the right answer choice, acknowledges the reasoning given for the conclusion and takes that reasoning and the attendant assumptions that are made, falsifies that assumption, and thereby moves the reasoning into weaker territory.